Thank you, Ravi and Rachel, for being here today. We're going to spend most of our time looking at the road ahead for carbon markets, but I did want to start by setting the scene, a bit of a historical recap. Maybe, Rachel, I'll start with you. What has gone right in voluntary carbon markets so far, and what have been the biggest failings?
Well, I suppose good morning, everybody. Bonjour. I suppose it depends where you begin the story. Right? I remember 4 years ago in Glasgow, being in a meeting with Greta Thunberg on the one side and Greenpeace activists and others decrying the idea of markets, and private investors and developing country representatives on the other decrying the lack of financial flows. And the purpose of that event was to talk about integrity, the integrity of supplies of credits, the integrity of what we are holding companies to account for. So I think we've come a long way. If you go all the way back, some of the innovation and some of the understanding of how to measure the impact of intact ecosystems and their importance, and this perpetual question of how we value nature, then it's been some of the people working on the edges of the voluntary carbon markets that have revealed the greatest learning over 20 to 30 years. But I think in the most recent past, this question of how we unlock the need of companies, especially those in hard-to-abate sectors, to be able to have some guardrails about what they can and cannot do, and what they are and are expected to do in managing their transitions, and unlock the need for financial flows to start flowing into not just nature, but also into the industrial transformations that are taking place in emerging markets. If we can lock those two things together in voluntary markets alongside compliance markets and Article 6, etc., it seems to me that we can't really walk away from that as being too hard. This is within our ability.
And with that context in mind, you are both, along with Kenya's Ali Mohammed, the co-chairs of the Coalition to Grow Carbon Markets. And Ravi, can you explain what you've been working on?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. Actually, it was just over a year ago, I think, at New York Climate Week, where we have had several groups coming together to firstly, to lament the state of the carbon markets, which has not been in great shape. There's been several abuses and, false claims made, and so the market was in disrepute. But I think there was a growing recognition in these meetings amongst us that the carbon markets are a vital and critical tool for closing the climate financing gap and for effective decarbonization. We just got to get our act together. We need to address problems on the supply side, problems on the demand side, look at what's the infrastructure that's required. And we also noticed that governments were kind of not in the picture. Many of the efforts were organically grown within the ecosystem of carbon markets, standard-setting bodies, certification bodies, NGOs, businesses, and so on. And it's quite amazing we've come this far. But there's growing recognition that governments need to step in to signal where we stand, that we support high-integrity carbon markets. This is necessary for closing the financing gap, and so on. And so small groups of us, and Rachel and I had many conversations on this. And it was, I think, at last year's COP that we thought maybe some like-minded governments, we should just step up and come forward and get into this act to signal our support and to signal the need for high-integrity markets. One thing led to another at Ecosparity in Singapore. That's when we kind of formally agreed on the coalition. And here we are on the eve of COP, ready with our first product, which is a set of shared principles that the coalition members worked on. Not just the coalition members, the coalition is still quite small, but more than 10 other countries who are participating in this effort from the outside, contributing ideas to what a set of shared principles will look like. And these are shared principles to signal under what circumstances corporates can purchase carbon credits. And the principles actually, we're underselling ourselves by calling it principles. It's actually a set of guidelines. If you go through it, you'll realize that it is probably the most detailed and specific set of guidance offered to corporates and businesses on the purchase of carbon credits, especially in the voluntary carbon market. So that's where we are. Coalition is less than a year old, but we've got a first product out, and there are a whole range of other issues that we want to work with. I just close off by saying all this is being done in response to business feedback. Businesses are saying, corporates were telling us, we want to buy credits, but we're not sure how. They're in a bad state. There's a lot of reputational risk. We need governments to tell us when and what kind of credits we can buy. Of course, we're not going to be prescriptive about those things, but we've given sufficient specific guidance through the SHAD principles that will give confidence. And early indications from businesses who have been part of this process, who have been contributing ideas to these SHAD principles, have told us this is important, this is good, this is going to help us.
And you mentioned some members of the coalition are public, obviously Singapore, UK, Kenya, France, Panama. Others have been contributing behind the scenes. Do you have a target in mind for how many countries are going to publicly endorse these principles, and who's next?
Well, a few have endorsed the principles publicly. Several others have welcomed it, and yet others have contributed to the process, but are still waiting to get their formal approvals internally before they can signal the support and joining the coalition, which you can imagine is a political process. You need to get endorsements from various ministries and so on, and that takes time through various countries. But we are actually quite hopeful that with this product now out in the public domain, a tangible expression of what we're doing, that we will get more traction on people joining the coalition.
So we've got, endorsing and welcoming and working with us, we've got Indonesia, Peru, South Africa, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and I know I'm forgetting somebody, and it's one of those wedding speeches that you never want to give, where you forgot your favourite aunt, but it's growing, and I don't think we have a target number in mind. The point is, in all of these kinds of ways of working, you get to a tipping point at well below 50% of the world's countries, right? So all it takes is a percentage of the world's economy, and then people start to see how we're going. And we're not being prescriptive, because different countries will choose different ways of regulating, setting guardrails, or incentivizing their corporates to engage with the voluntary carbon markets. And so there's no one way of doing it. I mean, what the UK is doing is different from Singapore, but with the same end goal in mind. So that's why we've come with these principles now, and then after COP we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty of maybe some more work on the how-to at a granular level.
And Rachel, this is a notably fractured time for climate diplomacy, let's put it that way. Is it safe to assume the US will not be endorsing the principles at this point?
Anybody can endorse the principles if they like them, so we'll see.
And I guess a somewhat related question. At the same time, some of the biggest historical players in the voluntary carbon market have been US companies, Delta, Chevron, Microsoft, etc. Do you think that will remain the case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about individual companies, but the need is still there, right? So the transitions that companies are are going through, in particular for hard-to-abate sectors, it's very difficult to imagine how they're going to manage their transition without access to the voluntary markets alongside other instruments. And I think the other thing is, if Ali were here, Ali Mohammed, our triplet from Kenya, the desperate need for the voluntary markets to grow quickly, to scale quickly the finance that developing countries and emerging markets need, that can't be underestimated. I was at the Africa Climate Summit just about a month ago, and I was completely taken aback by the laser-like focus on growing the carbon markets by all African countries, no matter what state of development. So, I don't think we can be King Canute about voluntary carbon markets or about the carbon markets more broadly. And at this COP, you will see the Brazilians talk, as Minister Haddad did earlier this morning, about taxonomies, the compliance markets, and the moving down, ratcheting down the sort of transaction cost between different approaches. We've got Article 6 coming underway. We've got Article 6.2 transactions of high integrity beginning to come forward. And then we've got the voluntary markets. And we need all of the above. And we need countries need the capacity to be able to engage in these markets in a way that makes sense for their growth, their prosperity, their nature and industrial processes if they're on the supply side, and for demand-generating countries like ours in order to speed up the momentum of the transition. I mean, we've made a 81% reduction over baseline levels NDC. It's extremely ambitious. We've been out and consulted on the voluntary carbon markets, our own corporate sector. You know, how we manage this is going to be a very important part, not only of how we manage our domestic transition, but how we engage with the rest of the world to help them manage theirs.
Actually, maybe I'll pick up on that, Ravi. As Rachel just said, there's multiple strands of work going on in carbon markets at the moment. There's Article 6, there's the Brazilian Open Coalition for Carbon Market Integration. For the uninitiated, this can seem a little confusing. So, Ravi, how would you explain what your coalition is doing as distinct from the other programs?
Well, what we're doing is largely complementary to all the efforts that are underway. As you can imagine, an ecosystem as complex as in carbon markets will have multiple players doing different things. What the coalition is trying to do is to see across the landscape, to look at the supply side issues, the demand side issues, the infrastructure issues, the regulatory and policy and incentive sets of issues. And then to actually work with parties who are already engaged in this space. On the supply side, I must say, on the integrity front, there's been very good progress. Today, the market is a lot more discerning about high quality, high integrity carbon credits. High integrity carbon credits typically fetch more than $6 to $8 per ton. Low integrity credits, or of an older vintage, are going for less than $2. The market is making that distinction. The efforts made by meta-standard setting bodies like ICVCM, for instance, I think have considerably advanced the confidence in the integrity of these credits. Vera has estimated that there are about $375 million worth of 375 million credits in the pipeline for CCP label. That's huge, because the existing stock is about 48 million. So there's a lot more high integrity credits coming into the pipeline to be certified, to be validated, and forming this supply. And on the demand side, like I said, there is a lot of willingness, and you asked about the US companies. Actually, the US companies are still very keen on carbon credits because they have climate goals they need to meet. And it has become more challenging in the current economic circumstances, be it for cost reasons or technological limits to how much they can decarbonize within the next 5 or 10 years. And so a natural thing to do is to get into the credit space. So I think there's a lot of work now being done on the demand side to provide clarity. And this is where the coalition has focused its efforts, because there's a kind of lacuna here, the voice of governments. There is also work underway on the infrastructure side, efforts being made to have greater transparency across registries so that you don't have the old problems of double counting and so on. The World Bank is involved in this space, GCMU. So actually, the different parts of the ecosystem are now congealing together in a nice way. And the coalition wants to play a facilitative role, adding the voice of government to these valid efforts to grow this market. And the tide is turning. The tide on carbon markets is turning. The last 1 year, I'd say. To date, for this year, more than $10 billion has been committed to carbon projects. That's 3 times more than the same period last year, first half of this year and first half of last year. So I think we're seeing a lot more momentum. This is a market that can build up to $5 billion, $10 billion perhaps by 2030 if we do all the right things. So we got to keep working at it. And I think there's another point I'd like to raise is that this is not just about decarbonization. I think it's a compelling tool for decarbonization. But there's growing recognition now that carbon markets have broader economic and social co-benefits in both the advanced economies of the high-income countries, which is a source of demand for the credits, as well as in the global south, the emerging economies, which are largely the suppliers of these credits. There are larger developmental benefits for the communities in these countries in terms of attracting foreign investment and capital, as part of carbon projects. There are improvements in, if it's forestry, improvements in that space. In the high-income countries, and I think both London and Singapore would be good examples of this, a vibrant carbon services ecosystem is taking shape. Yeah. Rating agencies, carbon credit ratings, third-party verification services, affirmation services. So new jobs, new value added being created because a new financial market is emerging to address a global problem. Mm-hmm. So I think it looks complex, but if you look at it carefully across ecosystem, things are falling into space. Still too early to declare victory. We need a lot more effort, but I think the next 3 to 5 years will be quite critical in turning this market decisively around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So as you just said, Singapore and London are both finance hubs. So this is partly a bet on growing your competitive finance hubs with a new product. Is that a fair way to think about it?
It's a necessary thing to do for climate. It's also the smart thing to do for economies and jobs. And it's also the right thing to do because you are helping communities in the global south improve their lives and livelihoods.
And this is meant to be an execution-focused COP, and you are certainly trying to execute quickly on this project. So, Rachel, if we look forward, let's say 2 years from now, what does success look like? Where do you want to have got to?
So I hope that at this COP, despite all the sort of noises off, there's going to be a real focus on the at-scale investability of our future, right? So in past COPs, we've had big diplomatic arguments, and there's been a sort of he said, she says about, who pays for what and who contributes to what, and that will continue. But I think the necessity of this moment is that we scale the ways in which we can multiply the flows of finance into countries to build their resilience, to protect their nature, which is their lifeblood for the future, and to move their transitions more quickly. That means market scale, right? To get to scale, we've got to be able to build new markets, deploy new markets, and find new revenue streams. So carbon markets tick all of those boxes, and we have to believe that we are capable of not letting the perfect slow down the good. We have to believe that there are counterparties that want to work together to make this work, and that everybody needs and wants integrity. And that we are capable of regulating voluntarily or through compliance markets in the process in which we know how to regulate, which is you try something, you amend it if it's not having the intended benefit or if it's having a negative impact that you weren't predicting. And so we are good enough to do this. We've done it on other things. And what I'm hoping is that when we look back, let's say in 2030, in COP33, which will be the end of the next cycle of evaluation, that we will see carbon markets in their different forms, producing a steady flow, and almost a predictive flow of finance into countries that desperately need it. And more countries will have regulated or set guardrails or administered the conditions for their private sector to speed up their transition. And that takes more things than just voluntary markets, but that we've done that. This is the COP where we're supposed to pivot from 10 years of negotiation to 10 years of accelerating implementation. I can't think how we can do that without a robust set of market tools, looking at carbon, but also then looking further beyond at some point to biodiversity and other forms of credits.
And Ravi, what do you expect from COP30? Even Bill Gates is starting to question the value of some climate spending. I'm not sure if you have read his memo. But what is your view on where the emphasis should be in terms of mitigation versus adaptation, and what the conversations should be in Berlin?
I think both are equally important. The world is heading towards a future that is both carbon constrained and climate impaired. It's already too late to stop some of the effects of climate change. They are already upon us. And so adaptation, I think, will have growing importance going forward. And I'm glad that this COP is beginning to put some emphasis on that aspect. We all have to think very seriously about adaptation financing and resilience building. Because climate change, even if tomorrow we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions, climate change will still run its course because of the emissions that are already in the atmosphere, the global warming process that's underway, and the planetary limits that are being breached, even as we speak. But it's never too late, because we can avoid the worst effects of climate change if we have decisive decarbonization in the next few years and decades. And so we need to be focused on mitigation just as much as we are on adaptation. So you can't throw up your hands in the air and say, it's only adaptation. Nor can you ignore adaptation, thinking that we can stop all aspects of climate change. It's already beginning to affect economies and livelihoods, and it's going to get worse. So I think we need efforts on both fronts.
And Rachel, you touched on this in some of your answer just before, but given the global environment, do you still see a place for this traditional COP process? How does it stay relevant in the years ahead, and can one ask the same question of the Paris Agreement?
Well, the Paris Agreement is relevant because it's working. It's not working fast enough, and it's not working far enough for too many, but it's clearly working. And, the leaders that are coming in 2 days' time to Belém are coming because they're going to defend multilateralism, which is undeniably under attack from different places. They're going to defend it because it is the best and only way we have to work together on a global problem. How on earth do we do this in small groups in isolation? So I think that we have to make clear that message comes through. But when it comes to the COPs, the United Nations, we the peoples, is an intergovernmental space. And the climate discussions have been pushing at the edges of what does that mean for a long time. And here we have Bloomberg through, investing in this forum and events in Rio, and then there will be other events going on involving the private sector and sub-sovereigns in these cities over the next few days, while governments and those who hold them to account will be in Belém. But now it's not everybody keeping their eyes on the negotiations. Yes, we'll still be negotiating, but the biggest emphasis now is how do you accelerate implementation? And how do you hold us all to account, not just for what we agreed to in the convention, not just to what countries have signed up to and agreed to in each of the action calls that have subsequently come through each of the COPs, but when you stand up on a stage and you make a methane pledge as a large oil multilateral, or as a large industrial company, or as a large city, or as a large region, or as a country, or as a large NGO, how do we engineer a system where we hold ourselves to account for that pledge? Because it's not just that when we measure the NDCs, we're not quite on track yet, and we need to see the leaders say that they will strive to do more where their NDCs are below the line of getting to 1.5. But it's how are we holding ourselves to account for the voluntary commitments that we've all made. And I think this is something that can be worked out kind of in the ways that we're working in this coalition, between government, between civil society, between the private sector, finance, and this is what the Brazilians, I think, are trying to help us focus on over the next 3 weeks in different forums in different places, because the public has a right to know that when you stand up on a stage and you say, I am going to double down on this, or I'm going to triple this, or I'm going to try harder on this, that there's some expectation that that isn't just PR. And so I think there's a much higher standard now of what is acceptable. And so the question then flows from that. The question of how do we organize COPs flows from, and how are we going to be holding ourselves to account for achievement and acceleration of implementation? Do we need a COP every year? I don't know, we could take a poll. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. The point is, what do we do when we come together? And I think there has to be a step change in what we do when we come together over the next decade of implementation.
And we are almost out of time, but Ravi, maybe I'll give you the last 45 seconds to just share your key takeaways on carbon markets for this audience. What do you want people to walk away and think about?
Well, I think for all its faults and all the problems that it's had in the past, carbon markets are indispensable to closing the climate financing gap. It addresses the needs of companies in the high-income countries to meet their targets. It addresses the needs of decarbonization in the global south. I think this double coincidence of wants coming together to create a market is a very compelling proposition. There are broader economic and social benefits arising from this, and so I would advise all corporates to seriously consider carbon credits as part of your overall decarbonization plan. You're having maximized your direct decarbonization. What can I do for decarbonization elsewhere? The last thought I'll leave with everyone is this. NDCs force us to think about our own country's mitigation, and that's important. Corporates think about their own mitigation, but let's not forget, a ton of CO2 released into the atmosphere in Brazil, or in the UK, or in Singapore, or in China, or in Mexico, has the same effect on the climate and affects us the same way. Carbon markets are a wonderful way to synergize efforts so that we can contribute to that global effort by making possible decarbonization in another location that would otherwise not have happened. You're making something happen which would not otherwise have happened by buying these credits. And so I think that's the last thought I'd like to leave, that we need to invest in this market, make it grow, make it vibrant, and create not just a sustainable planet, but also economic and social development.
Rachel, Ravi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.